Joe, a decades-old mystery that has haunted Traverse City for nearly 36 years may finally be resolved. Tonight, the Grand Traverse Sheriff's Office announced the arrest of a 63-year-old Leelanau County man for open murder. It's related to the 1989 disappearance and murder of Linda Meteer.
In the late afternoon of Thursday, April 27, 1989, the body of an unidentified female homicide victim was discovered in Hoosier Valley.
That victim was identified as 41-year-old Linda Meteer, a sister, daughter, and mother of 5.
Almost everybody was drawn to my mom. She had an outgoing personality. I love her and I miss her.
In 1989, a task force was formed to investigate Linda's murder.
The task force worked for many years attempting to identify and criminally charge a suspect, but were unsuccessful.
However, investigators never gave up.
The Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Office has continued throughout the years to investigate this unsolved murder.
We're looking at all the evidence that was collected, what was done with it, what can be done with it. We're looking at witness statements from back then, seeing if there's anything that we can improve upon during that statement or clarify during that interview with those people.
Determined to let Linda's family know she was never forgotten.
Feel like it happened yesterday. I think just because it's been unsolved and the what ifs, always the what ifs that keep it right there at the surface.
Now, almost 36 years later, some of those what ifs have finally been answered.
The Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Office arrested a 63-year-old Leelanau County man for open murder related to the 1989 death of Linda Meteer.
Just days before her disappearance, the family gathered for Easter. A neighbor's camcorder captured it. The footage is grainy, the kind of film where the colors bleed at the edges, but you can still see her. Linda, adjusting her daughter's bow, holding her son close for the photo. The camera zooms in on her smile, a smile frozen in time. One of the last moments ever recorded of her alive. And then came April 13th, 1989, the night everything changed. Linda wasn't the type to go out often, but that night, her friends insisted a short break, a few drinks, a rare chance to relax. She said yes, it was supposed to be simple, but sometimes the smallest choices open the darkest doors. It starts with a call, not the kind of call you ever want to hear. A voice, low, panicked, breaking through static on a 911 line. You need to send someone. I think we found her. Then silence. A dispatcher's calm but urgent voice takes over. Units respond. Sirens begin to wail. It's the kind of sound that tears through a quiet Michigan night. The kind of sound that means something is terribly wrong. But here's the thing, that call wouldn't happen until days later. Back in April 1989, no one knew what was coming. That spring began like any other. Soft winds, blooming cherry blossoms, a Midwest town settling into warmer days, and a mother who had no idea her time was running out. Before we move forward with this thrilling story, please take a moment to comment below with the city you're watching from. Also, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on your notification bell to stay updated. For exclusives and other cool perks, you can join the channel. Link is in the description. Share the video with others. Stories like this must be heard. Her name was Linda Meteer, 36 years old, a woman described as warm, giving, impossible not to like. She had 2 children who adored her, a family that depended on her and a smile that seemed to hold the whole room together. Friends remember her laughter, the way she'd make jokes in the kitchen, even when times were tough. Her children remember her patience, the way she'd kneel down, eye level, to tie a shoelace, the way she'd whisper comfort at bedtime when nightmares came. These little details matter because they remind us what was stolen. That evening, Linda arrived at a neighborhood bar in Springfield, Michigan, the kind of place where the neon buzzes in the window, where jukebox songs mix with the clink of glasses, where no one expects a tragedy to begin. She was seen laughing, talking, witnesses. Remember her that night, alive, vibrant. Full of energy, nothing seemed wrong, nothing seemed dangerous. But here's where the story takes its first chilling turn, because that bar was the last place anyone would ever see her. At 11:30, she was still there. By midnight, gone. No cameras, no cell phones, no record of where she went or who she left with. One moment she was surrounded by people, the next, she vanished into the dark. Back at home, her children were asleep, her husband waiting, glancing at the clock. The hours kept ticking. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3. The house grew colder, the silence heavier, with every passing minute. Worry sharpened into dread. Linda was reliable, predictable. She didn't disappear. She always came home until that night. By dawn, the truth was undeniable. Something was wrong. Her family filed a missing persons report. Police, dispatchers took the call. Patrol units spread across Calhoun County. Every road checked, every ditch searched, every shadow questioned, but there was no trace of her. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. And here's what keeps people awake at night. If someone can vanish that easily, what does it say about safety in a quiet Michigan town? What does it say about the secrets people keep? For the first few hours, there was still hope. Maybe she left with a friend. Maybe her car broke down. Maybe she'd walk through the front door at any moment. But she didn't. Instead, the silence deepened. The worry spread. Friends began calling around. No one had seen her. No one knew anything. It didn't make sense. And when things don't make sense, that's when fear takes over. Detectives began canvassing, asking questions, reconstructing her last movements. But all they had was a bar, a few witnesses, and a timeline that ended in a void. And then came the realization no one wanted to admit. Linda wasn't just missing. Something far darker had happened, because Linda Meteer would never make it home that night, and the reason why would remain buried in silence for 36 years. 1989. A young mother disappears without warning. For 35 years, the silence was unbearable. Detectives boxed the evidence. Families mourned, and the killer walked free. Until one day, decades later, a single strand of DNA cracked the mystery wide open. But here's the haunting truth. Linda's case isn't unique. Across America, there are more than 250,000 cold cases. Every one of them has a box of evidence. Every one of them holds secrets. And most will never be solved. Why? Because without the right code, the right way to read the evidence, the truth stays buried. That's why I created the Cold Case Code. It's not just an ebook. It's a guide into the real world of unsolved mysteries. Inside, you'll see how investigators turn silence into breakthroughs, the overlooked clues that crack cases years later, the mistakes that bury the truth even deeper, and the forensic tools that are rewriting history right now. If Linda's story shook you, imagine understanding exactly how cases like hers go from forgotten files to courtroom justice. This is your chance to step inside the detective's shoes, to see the map investigators follow when the trail is ice cold, to learn the code behind every solved mystery. The link is in the description. Download your copy of the Cold Case Code, because justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. And the next time you hear about a case going cold, you'll know the hidden system that might just bring it back to life. The posters went up before dawn, hundreds of them. Her smile, frozen in time, staring out from every telephone pole, every gas station, every diner window. Neighbors who never exchanged more than a nod now stood shoulder to shoulder, taping her face to brick walls. It wasn't just a missing flyer, it was a warning. Someone had vanished and nobody knew how. By midday, the town had split into search parties. Pickup trucks lined the edges of cornfields. Men in muddy boots pushed through tall grass. Mothers and daughters combed drainage ditches with sticks, poking at the earth, hoping they wouldn't find what they feared. Each flashlight beam felt like a question. Every rustle in the woods made hearts pound. At night, the silence was unbearable. One father whispered, "If she's out there, why can't we hear her?" But here's the chilling detail the searchers found. Nothing, not a shoe, not a shred of clothing, not even a broken branch. It was as if she'd stepped off the road and vanished into thin air. And that impossibility kept people awake at night, because if someone could disappear without a trace here in their town, in their neighborhood, then nobody was safe. Within 24 hours, the media storm hit. Cameras rolled. News anchors leaned into microphones. Their voices sharp, their faces grim, archival. Clips from that week show words that still echo. Unprecedented, unexplained, unbelievable. The case wasn't just a local mystery. Anymore, it was a spectacle, a story that could play on repeat in every living room across the state. But coverage came at a cost. Tips flooded the hotline, hundreds of them. Every ring of the phone raised hopes, only to crush them minutes later. One caller insisted she'd been seen, hitchhiking miles away. Another claimed to hear muffled screams in a wooded area. Each lead sounded convincing, each. One dissolved into nothing. Detectives grew desperate. They started from scratch, building a timeline minute by minute. Who saw her last? Who spoke to her? Who heard something unusual? Friends replayed the night over and over in interviews. Family repeated the same answers until their voices cracked. The timeline looked clean, too clean, as if someone had scrubbed the truth out of it. Rumors filled the gaps, and rumors have teeth. Some said she'd run away, others whispered about secret relationships. One even suggested abduction by someone she trusted. But no matter the theory, the result was the same: confusion, suspicion. Turned neighbor against neighbor. Every sideways glance carried accusation. Every locked door told the same story. Fear was spreading faster than the truth inside her home. The family unraveled. Children asked questions no one could answer. Why isn't she back yet? Is she cold? Is she scared? Relatives stopped sleeping. They paced the floors, chain-smoking, staring at phones that never rang with the call they prayed for. When they did speak on camera, their words were barely whispers. Each sentence felt like a confession, each pause like a collapse. They weren't just losing her, they were losing themselves. And yet, the town rallied. Hundreds gathered with candles in hand. Parking lots glowed with flickering lights. Voices rose in prayer. Trembling but determined. It wasn't just about finding her anymore. It was about holding the line against despair, against the idea that she might already be gone. But beneath the hope, the dread lingered, because after 7 days of searching, of pleading, of praying, there were still no answers, no trace, no closure, just an unbearable silence. And then, just when everyone thought the trail was cold, a new voice broke it. Not a detective, not a reporter, not even a neighbor, a mushroom hunter. He walked into the sheriff's office with a story that would change everything. He said he'd seen something out in the woods, something strange, something the search teams had missed. Detectives leaned in. The room went still, because if what he claimed was true, the mystery wasn't just about where she went. It was about what had been hiding in plain sight all along, and what he revealed next would leave the entire town stunned, because it wasn't just a clue. It was a crack in the whole case. Could the answer have been lying there, waiting, while everyone searched everywhere else? The call came in just after sunrise. A mushroom hunter out in the woods. His voice shaking on the 911 tape. He didn't say much, only that he'd found something that didn't belong there. Dispatchers pressed him for details. He hesitated, then whispered one word that froze the line: body. Within minutes, squad cars tore down gravel roads, sirens off, lights silent. Not to draw attention, not yet. They reached the tree line and stepped into stillness. Every footfall was careful, every breath shallow. Yellow tape went up. Forensic vans rolled in. The air shifted from ordinary woods to something darker, something sacred. A crime scene. Detectives walked in first. They saw what the hunter had stumbled across, and it stopped them cold. This was no accident. This was no natural death. It was violence, the kind that leaves scars even on seasoned officers. But here's where it gets chilling. The scene was intact, but the surroundings told another story. No signs of a struggle, no signs of forced entry into the woods. Almost as if she had been placed there, intentionally, deliberately, like someone wanted her to be found, but not too soon. The medical examiner arrived. Gloves on, tools in hand. The scene was documented with slow precision. Photos, sketches, evidence bags, every fragment of soil, every broken twig catalogued. The examiner's early notes were careful, almost cautious. But one thing was certain. This was homicide. The results, later released, would confirm what detectives already feared. The cause wasn't hidden. It screamed from the evidence, and the deliberate nature of it sent shivers through the department. Because whoever did this hadn't acted in a frenzy. They had acted with intent, with control, with calculation. Detectives who spoke years later admitted they'll never forget the sight. One recalled the silence, another remembered the smell. But all of them repeated the same phrase. It didn't feel random. And while investigators processed the woods, another task loomed, telling the family. Officers drove to the house in silence, parked at the curb, walked up the steps with lead in their shoes. The knock on the door was slow, deliberate. Inside, voices rose, crying, wailing, the kind of grief that echoes through walls and never leaves. This moment, more than the discovery, more than the crime scene, was the breaking point. The family's hope collapsed into something else entirely. Not closure, not peace, but raw devastation. And yet even in tragedy, procedure continued. A task force was assembled that very night. Veteran detectives, forensic specialists, FBI advisors, maps spread across tables, timelines pinned to walls, every theory debated, every possible suspect listed. The strategy was clear. Strike fast, strike hard, before leads went cold. But here's where the story twists again. Despite the manpower, despite the urgency, despite the promises, the case did not break open. Instead, it began to slip. Evidence trickled instead of flowing. Tips led nowhere, and whispers grew louder. What if this case wasn't meant to be solved? By the end of the week, one chilling truth emerged, despite their best efforts, despite the endless hours, despite the desperate drive for justice, the case was already starting to go cold. And that's the moment the investigation turned from a sprint into a marathon, a battle against time itself, a battle that would haunt detectives for decades, because the question remained, who could do this? And more terrifying, why? The list of suspects was long, too long, but one by one, they were crossed off. A neighbor seen near the woods that morning, cleared. A drifter rumored to camp by the creek, cleared. Even a relative whispered about at family gatherings, interviewed, polygraphed, then cleared. And with every name removed, hope shrank. Detectives admitted later, each elimination felt less like progress, more like quicksand. The harder they pushed, the deeper they sank. But here's the chilling part. There was no single prime suspect, no shadowy figure they could all agree on. Instead, the case fractured into fragments, a dozen small possibilities, none strong enough to hold, and yet the family kept asking the question that never goes away. If it wasn't them, then who? Most people think investigations fall apart because no one cares. That's wrong. In 1989, these detectives cared too much, but they were fighting blind. Listen to this. DNA testing was just emerging. In fact, the FBI didn't even start running CODIS, the National DNA Database, until 1990. Back then, forensic science wasn't a weapon. It was a hope. And for this case, hope was never enough. Blood typing, too broad, fingerprints, none clear enough to match. Fibers, collected, but meaningless, without a suspect to pin them on. Evidence that today might unlock the case. In 1989, it just sat in sealed envelopes, waiting, growing cold. Detectives tried everything else: door-to-door interviews, roadblocks, even polygraph tests. Tools they admitted privately were shaky at best, but the results were always the same: inconclusive. One detective years later called it a hall of mirrors. Every lead reflected back nothing. Every tip ended in smoke, and still they couldn't walk away. The hours piled up, day after day, night after night. Coffee cups on desks, ashtrays full, stacks of paper reports with no answers. And then came the quiet confessions. Not in court, not in press conferences, but decades later in interviews. I regret things I didn't see. I regret the calls I didn't follow. I regret thinking we had more time. One officer admitted he still drives past the woods sometimes. He doesn't stop. He doesn't get out. He just stares because he knows. The answers are buried in the silence of that place. The evidence wasn't just thin, it was fragile. One mistake, one mishandled item, and the truth might be lost forever. And detectives feared that's exactly what had happened. If the perpetrator walked free that night, where did they go? And more haunting, what did they do next? That single thought poisoned every silence, every long shift, every sleepless night. Because if this person had the discipline to leave nothing behind, then they might already be planning the next. And so, the case balanced on a knife's edge, between determination and despair, between the chase for truth and the slow collapse into cold case limbo. But before it fell, something else surfaced. Something small. Something almost overlooked. And that would change everything. The word hit like a hammer. Cold. It wasn't just a label, it was a death sentence for the investigation, a silent admission that after years of work, detectives had nothing. In 1995, the task force disbanded. The case of Linda Meteer, just 6 years old, was now a cold case. And in the world of homicide, cold rarely means solved. It means stalled. It means forgotten. It means the perpetrator still walks free. Think about that for a moment. The person who ended Linda's life was still out there, breathing the same air, shopping in the same stores, blending into the same community, and no one could stop them. Inside the station, the mood was grim. Detectives lined the hallway as the boxes were carried away, brown cardboard sealed with thick black tape. On the side, scrawled in permanent marker, Meteer, 1989. Folders stuffed with interviews, photos of the crime scene, the clothing Linda had been wearing the night she vanished. Every detail of her last day, sealed in silence, locked in steel cabinets in the evidence room, where they would sit year after year, dust settling on top, while the perpetrator remained untouched. But here's the chilling part. Those very boxes, dismissed as dead weight in 1995, would one day hold the answer. The truth was already there. Hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes, the right science, the right moment. For now, though, all the detective could do was close the door, and with it, a piece of his own soul. He had promised Linda's family answers. He had sworn he wouldn't stop. But the investigation had drained everything from him, endless leads that went nowhere. Suspects cleared one after another, evidence that gave more questions than solutions. The frustration became a weight he couldn't escape. He stopped sleeping. He started drinking more coffee, staying late at the office, staring at the same photographs, the same trail through the woods, the same hollow eyes staring back at him from morgue photos. Nothing changed. Nothing moved. The silence mocked him, and it wasn't just professional failure. The case bled into his personal life. Friends said he looked 20 years older than he was. His marriage began to strain. Conversations at home turned cold, just like the case. Every family dinner ruined by the shadow of a promise unfulfilled. One night, years later, he confessed to a reporter, "This case, it broke me. You don't bury it, you carry it, every day, every night." Meanwhile, Linda's family was living a different nightmare. The phone stopped ringing, detectives stopped visiting, and the updates that once brought fragile hope disappeared. Imagine waiting by the phone year after year, every ring a rush of adrenaline, every silence a dagger. And when the call finally came, it was always the same words. No news. Birthdays passed. Christmas dinners carried on with an empty chair. Family photographs were taken with a space left open. Because even if they smiled for the camera, Linda's absence never left the frame. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was cruel, and it stretched into every corner of their lives. But here's what makes this story unbearable. While Linda's family drowned in grief and unanswered questions, her perpetrator was free, living, thriving, building a life on the foundation of someone else's death. And that central question still lingered year after year. If the case was cold, could it ever be thawed? Because history shows us something disturbing. Most cold cases never see daylight again. Evidence degrades, witnesses die, memories fade, and all them. Trail only grows darker, but sometimes, just sometimes, science evolves, technology advances, and a single thread of evidence can tear open decades of silence. For Linda's family, though, none of that was visible in 1995. All they saw was the closing of a door. All they felt was the weight of silence. And as the years stretched on, they began to understand something no family ever should. The silence was only just beginning. The seasons kept changing, but grief didn't. Autumn leaves fell. Snow blanketed the town. Spring came with its blooms. Summer burned the air hot and heavy. And through it all, Linda was still gone. At first, the town remembered. The vigils were crowded. Hundreds gathered in church halls and candlelit parks. They prayed. They cried. They promised Linda would not be forgotten. But promises are easy. Time is harder. By the 5th anniversary, the crowd thinned. Neighbors who once held candles now stayed home. The reporters who once filled notebooks stopped showing up. The story was no longer news. By the 10th anniversary, only family remained, clutching photographs, clutching each other, their faces lined with 10 more years of waiting, 10 more years of silence. Imagine it, lighting a candle every year, knowing the perpetrator might still be alive, knowing they might even be in that very crowd, watching, listening, smiling. That's the nightmare. The perpetrator wasn't in prison. The perpetrator wasn't punished. The perpetrator was free. Was he walking the same streets as Linda's family? Was he standing at the grocery store checkout behind them? Was he driving past their house at night? Because if he was, he knew what he had done, and he knew he had gotten away with it. But what the perpetrator didn't know was that time was a double-edged sword. Every year he walked free. Science was evolving. Technology was catching up. And one day, the silence wouldn't protect him. Still, in the 1990s and 2000s, that future was invisible. All the family could feel was absence. It stretched into every corner of their lives. Christmas dinners with an empty chair, birthdays with an unwrapped gift that no one dared open, family portraits with a space left in the middle, because even if they smiled for the camera, Linda's absence never left the frame. Her children grew older, her friends graduated, life kept moving, but Linda was frozen in time, 36 years old. Forever 36, her mother once said. I feel like I'm raising my other children while burying Linda again every day. That sentence alone tells you the cost of grief wasn't an event, it was a lifestyle. And here's the cruelest cut. As the years passed, the silence didn't just remain, it deepened, it hardened, until even the town itself stopped saying her name. At school, her children's classmates stopped mentioning her. New students didn't even know who she was. The younger generation grew up in the same streets, walked the same trails, but didn't know that a woman's body had once been found there. The silence became so complete. It was like Linda never existed, but the family remembered every day. Every hour her absence was louder. than any sound. And this is where most families break. The years crush them. The unanswered questions destroy them. But Linda's family did something else. They fought back. They wrote letters to police. They begged for updates. They held press conferences. Even when no press showed up, they knocked on doors. They kept her name alive because they knew something vital. A cold case isn't closed. It's only sleeping. And if you keep pushing, sometimes, just sometimes, the case wakes up again. But hope wasn't gentle. It was brutal. It teased them. Every phone call could be the call. Every knock on the door could be news. But every time, it wasn't. That emotional whiplash lasted not for weeks, not for months, but for decades. Imagine being Linda's younger relatives. Growing up knowing your family member was taken, but nobody was caught. Imagine wondering if the person who harmed her was sitting behind you at a high school football game, or standing at the same gas station pump, or walking past your window at night. That kind of fear doesn't fade. It seeps into your bones. And then comes something incredible. Because during these long, empty decades, something was changing. Something invisible. Something no one could yet see. Forensic science was evolving. DNA databases were expanding. Techniques that were impossible in 1989 were becoming standard by 2010. And with every year, the perpetrator's window of safety was closing. But Linda's family didn't know that. All they knew was grief. One brother confessed, "I can't celebrate my birthday anymore. Every candle feels wrong." Because she'll never blow hers out again. That's the kind of detail that sticks to your soul. Because grief doesn't just take the person. It takes everything that would have come. After anniversaries, graduations, weddings, grandchildren, all of it stolen in one night. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was cruel, and it lasted 35 years. But then comes the turning point, because in 2024, the silence finally cracked. Boxes sealed since 1989 were reopened. New eyes looked at the old evidence. And the one thing no one expected was that the answer had been there all along. How does a family survive? 35 years of waiting? How do you keep believing when everyone else has given up? And what happens when the silence finally breaks? They thought her story was over, buried under decades of silence, just another forgotten cold case file gathering dust in a basement. But then something happened that no one, especially her family, saw coming. Western Michigan University, a place known for students, football games, and research. Suddenly, it became the unlikely battleground for justice. Why? Because inside its halls, a new experiment was born. The cold case. Program not detectives, not prosecutors, but professors and students, barely in their 20s, decided to do the unthinkable. They were going to take on the cases that even seasoned investigators had abandoned. Imagine this, future lawyers, criminologists and historians sitting around a table, opening boxes of forgotten evidence, photographs yellowed with age, typed reports with ink fading to grey, handwritten notes from detectives long retired or long dead. And on top of one of those boxes, her name, Linda Meteer. Most people would call it impossible. What could college kids find that police couldn't in 35 years? But that's exactly why this moment matters, because it wasn't just about evidence anymore. It was about endurance, about refusing to let time erase the truth. Here's where it gets chilling. The files were disorganized, scattered, some stored in cardboard boxes, some nearly destroyed by years of neglect. And if nothing was done, if those records were lost forever, Linda's story would vanish too. So the students began a new kind of investigation, not with guns and badges, but with scanners, laptops, and hard drives. Every page digitized, every note cataloged, every single thread of information preserved. One student later said, "It felt like Linda's voice was trapped inside those papers. And if we didn't do this, she'd never be heard again." Suddenly, Hope returned, not from police, not from government funding, but from students working late nights in a university basement. Think about that for a second. A family waiting nearly 4 decades for justice. And now, strangers, kids young enough to be Linda's own children, were fighting for her. This wasn't just academic curiosity, it was personal. For every student who held those files, it became a mission. They weren't chasing a grade, they were chasing a ghost. And the family, they couldn't believe it. After all the dead ends, all the empty promises, they were told, "We are reopening Linda's case. Can you feel the shift?" For 35 years, nothing. And then in 2024, a spark. But here's the haunting question that still lingered. Would this new effort finally uncover the truth? Or would it just prolong the agony of waiting? Because if the students failed, if the evidence led nowhere, if the suspects were long dead, then all of this would end in silence again. And yet, as the files glowed on computer screens, as photos were restored from the brink of decay, and as forgotten witness statements re-emerged, the family felt something they hadn't in decades: hope. Not blind hope, but living, breathing, fighting hope. And now, the stage was set. The long wait wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about renewal, a rebirth of a case thought long dead. But what those students would uncover next is something no one, absolutely no one, was ready for. They thought the past was sealed, but science has a way of rewriting history. In 1989, DNA was little more than a dream, barely understood, rarely used. Back then, it couldn't save Linda Meteer, but today, it's the single most powerful weapon in the war against time. And here's the cold truth. It only takes one microscopic fragment, one cell, one invisible trace left behind at the scene. And suddenly, the past has nowhere left to hide. This is where the story shifts, because what was once invisible is now screaming to be seen. Think about this. Your entire identity, your entire family tree, coded into every cell of your body. DNA never lies. It remembers everything. It survives almost anything. And now, in the 21st century, it can expose the darkest secrets. Detectives had always hoped DNA would unlock Linda's case. But for decades, it wasn't possible. The technology wasn't there. The evidence wasn't strong enough. And so her file sat in silence. But then, 2024, a new push, a new method, forensic genealogy, not just testing DNA, but building entire family trees, tracing connections across generations, finding the suspects not by their names, but by their bloodlines. This method has already solved cases once thought impossible. Cases older than Linda's, cases colder than hers. Take the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo. For 40 years, he taunted police, a predator who left behind no name. But when his DNA was uploaded to a genealogy database, suddenly, a family tree emerged, and at the center of that tree was him, a retired cop, living in plain sight. That's how powerful this method is. It didn't just solve one case, it solved 50. And then Deborah Jackson, known only as Orange Socks, found deceased in 1979, unidentified for decades, until DNA and genealogy brought her name back, her humanity restored, her story reclaimed. If DNA could identify a woman without a name, what could it do for a woman like Linda, whose family never stopped screaming her name? So the cold case team got to work. The evidence, preserved all these years, was carefully reopened. Envelopes, sealed since the 1980s, fibers stored in sterile bags, items touched by the perpetrator, items no one had looked at in years, every piece handled like gold, every fragment treated as if it could shatter the case. Gloved hands, sterile labs, machines humming. The evidence went through a process unthinkable back in 1989. They weren't just looking for a match. They were looking for a map. From fragments of DNA, genealogists began building branches, distant cousins, uncles, half-siblings. Most of them had never even heard of Linda, but their blood held the answers. Imagine that, living your life, unaware that your very biology could solve a case, a knock at your door. Detectives saying your great-uncle's DNA is close to the person we're hunting. That's not fiction. That's how these cases are cracked. And it sent a chill through everyone who touched Linda's file, because suddenly the perpetrator wasn't faceless anymore. He had roots, he had a family, he had a trail. But here's where it gets darker. Genealogy doesn't just give answers, it gives options. Sometimes hundreds of possible relatives, entire family networks that must be untangled. So detectives found themselves staring at sprawling trees of connections, names they'd never seen before, places they'd never investigated, and somewhere hidden within that maze was the truth. What if the truth wasn't a stranger? What if it was someone the family already knew? The forensic tools sharpened, touch DNA analysis, the ability to pull genetic material from objects barely touched by a stir, testing, tracing male lineages across generations, mitochondrial DNA, tracking maternal lines through time, techniques that had once been science fiction, now standard, each one peeling back the layers of secrecy. But here's the emotional dagger. Science moves fast, but justice still crawls. For the family, waiting became agony all over again. Every test meant more time. Every lead meant more suspense. They had already endured decades. Now they faced months of silence. But this time, with the weight of hope crushing them, and then something shifted, buried in the digitized files. A note overlooked, a statement ignored, a witness detail forgotten. On its own, it was nothing, but when cross-checked with the new DNA evidence, it didn't just raise suspicion, it detonated it. A name began to emerge, not clear, not confirmed, but enough to stop detectives in their tracks, because if this name was right, then someone had slipped through the cracks all along. Someone who had been in the shadows from the very beginning. If the name was there, hiding all this time, how did no one see it? Buried in those files was a clue that would change everything. They thought they had exhausted every test, but in 2024, the evidence was pulled out one last time. And when the seals cracked open, the air in the room shifted. This was it, the final shot, the last chance to drag a faceless perpetrator out of the shadows. Tiny swabs, fibers, objects, touched and forgotten in 1989, each. One carried the same chilling question. Was the perpetrator's genetic fingerprint still hiding there? The technicians knew the stakes. Every movement was deliberate. Every second felt like a countdown. Because if the samples failed, Linda's story would stay unsolved forever. But then something, a partial DNA profile. Faint, fragile, like a whisper through time. Most people would have dismissed it. Too small, too degraded. But modern sequencing doesn't need perfection. It just needs a spark. Think about this. In 1989, DNA required a visible stain, a drop of blood. A hair with root attached today? Just a handful of cells, skin cells invisible to the naked eye, cells that can survive decades, clinging to fibers, hiding in envelopes sealed in darkness. That's what scientists were hunting, and step by step, they pulled it apart. First, extraction, breaking open the cells, releasing the genetic code, then amplification, copying fragments until the faintest sequence became a readable signal. Machines whirring, digital bars climbing on a monitor, each blip pulling. Detectives closer to a face they hadn't seen in 35 years. Would it lead to a stranger or someone who had always been hiding in plain sight? The process wasn't quick. Days stretched into weeks. Every new run carried both hope and dread, because the nightmare scenario was clear. What if the DNA pointed to no one? What if the system spat out silence? That silence would be worse than death. But then a breakthrough. The profile stabilized. Enough alleles aligned. The sequence was viable. For the first time since 1989, the perpetrator's DNA wasn't just theory. It was real, alive, a code that could speak. The genetic map was uploaded into national databases.codis.statearchives.law enforcement. Networks. The screen blinked. Matches. Scrolled by. Distant relatives. Third cousins. Obscure. Connections. Not the perpetrator, not yet, but the branches of his family tree. And suddenly, detectives were staring at something new, a path, a direction, a bloodline. Genealogists took over, using public records, birth certificates, obituaries, marriage licenses, piece by piece. They stitched together a sprawling family web. At the edges, innocent lives, names of people with no idea their DNA was helping solve a case. But at the center of that web, a single branch kept pulling focus. It was narrow, it was recent, and it led to a man. For decades, his name had never surfaced, but now, the science was pointing directly at him. Detectives didn't celebrate, yet they couldn't afford to, because one mistake could collapse the entire case. So, verification began, multiple checks, independent. Labs, every sequence rerun, every number scrutinized. Weeks of silence followed. The family waited, restless, aching. Every phone call could mean closure or devastation. Finally, confirmation. The DNA wasn't just similar, it wasn't just probable, it was a match, a perfect, scientific match. If this result held true, the face of Linda's perpetrator was about to be revealed to the world. But one question clawed at the edge of the breakthrough. If this man was the perpetrator, how had he escaped suspicion for 35 years? And that question would explode everything. The name came out of the database like a lightning strike. A man living in the very same state where Linda once dreamed of her future. A man who had walked freely for 35 years. He wasn't hiding in a cave. He wasn't living under a false identity. He was right there, shopping in the same stores, driving the same streets, even waving to neighbors who never suspected a thing. Detectives stared at his file. No record of violent crime, just traffic citations, a quiet, ordinary life. But the DNA said otherwise. The science didn't lie. How does a man accused of such brutality slip into a normal life? And why had no one ever connected him to Linda before? His background shocked investigators. He had a steady job, a family. He blended in so well that even his closest friends could never imagine him capable of such violence. But behind the mask of normalcy, his DNA was screaming the truth. And now, the question wasn't if he was guilty. The question was, how do you bring him in without alerting him? That's where tactical planning began. Detectives moved in silence. They couldn't risk a leak. One rumor in town, one whisper, and he could run, or worse, he could destroy evidence. Step 1, confirm his movements. Surveillance teams tracked his routine work home errands patterns of a man who thought his past was buried. Step 2, secure the warrant hours of paperwork. Judges briefed legal channels. Double-checked, because when they went in, it had to be airtight, no mistakes. The warrant came back signed, and with that signature, 35 years of silence cracked open. Would he go quietly? Or would the arrest spiral into chaos? The operation was set for dawn, when the world is groggy, when even the guilty sleep soundly. Officers staged blocks away, unmarked. Plain clothes, bulletproof. Vests hidden beneath jackets, every detail rehearsed, every outcome prepared. For the command whispered through radios, move, and suddenly the quiet street transformed. Boots on pavement, gloved hands gripping weapons. A house surrounded in seconds. One officer knocked, another called his name. Silence. Then the creak of a door. He appeared, confused, half awake, unaware his entire life was about to collapse. The order was given, hands up! Steel cuffs clicked around his wrists, and just like that, the man who had once stolen Linda's future was no longer free. Neighbors spilled outside, phones recording, mouths hanging open, because to them, he wasn't a perpetrator. He was just the man next door. And yet, the truth was undeniable. His DNA had betrayed him. Hours later, the news broke. A press conference, cameras flashing, reporters shouting. The district attorney read the charges out. Loud, Homicide. Premeditated. Cold. Calculated. The words cut like blades. For the first time, Linda's case had a name. Attached, the faceless phantom was gone. A real man stood, accused. But the press conference wasn't the most powerful moment. That came after, because as reporters, scribbled notes and detectives stood tall. Linda's family was watching for decades. They had lived with silence, with questions, with fear that justice would never come. Now, tears streamed down their faces, their voices broke. They clutched each other as the charges echoed through the air. It wasn't closure yet, but it was hope, the kind they had begged for since 1989. The man who thought he had beaten time, who thought he had outlived his crime, was now facing trial. What had he been hiding all those years? And that, investigators promised, was only the beginning. The courtroom doors creaked open, and with that sound, 35 years of silence shattered. He walked in, not in chains this time, but in a suit. Polished shoes tapping against the marble floor, the same hands once bound in, cuffs now folded neatly on the defense table, but no suit could hide what the DNA revealed. No tie could erase the stain of 1989. Here's where the tension spikes. The jury, 12 strangers holding the power of a lifetime. The judge, calm, deliberate, staring over the rim of glasses. And Linda's family sitting front row, clutching tissues, gripping hands. Bracing for the storm, the prosecutor stood, her voice firm. This case is about a promise, she began. A promise that even after decades, the truth does not die. Linda's story demands justice. And today, you will hear why. But what happens when the defense fights back? The defense attorney rose slowly. He pointed not to evidence, but to time. 35 years, he said. Memories fade. Witnesses forget. Science can be wrong. Ask yourself, are you willing to convict a man on a strand of DNA alone? The words hung heavy in the air. Was the science enough? Or would doubt creep in? The jury leaned forward. Every eye locked on the exhibits, photographs, case, files, the DNA profile, numbers, and markers stacked like a silent fingerprint. The prosecution called experts, lab technicians, geneticists, each on walking the jury through the chain of evidence. Step by step, no gaps, no errors, no mistakes. The science was airtight, but then came the emotional blow. Linda's children took the stand. Their voices shook. They spoke of birthdays without their mother, graduations with an empty chair, decades of silence, carrying a wound no one could see. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Some wiped their eyes, because this wasn't just evidence, it was a life stolen. Still, the defense fought back, cross-examinations sharp as knives, every witness pressed, every memory questioned. Are you sure? Could you be mistaken? Isn't it true? The trial became a chess game of law and memory, science and doubt. One move forward, another challenged, and then the prosecution revealed something the defense never wanted shown. Surveillance footage, recent. From his quiet suburban life, the man accused, seen visiting a wooded area at night, no reason given, no explanation, but the implication chilled the room. What else had he been hiding all these years? Gasps rippled across the gallery. Reporters scribbled frantically. The jury stared harder now, closing arguments. The prosecutor's voice rose. Linda was more than evidence. She was a daughter, a mother, a human being. And today, you decide whether her story ends in silence or in justice. The defense countered. If the state cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt, then you must let him walk free. That is the law. That is fairness. The jury filed out. Hours stretched into eternity. Linda's family sat frozen, their lives hanging on 12 strangers. Finally, the knock at the door. The jury returned. Every breath in the courtroom stopped. The foreperson stood, paper in hand, voice trembling. We, the jury, find the defendant. Silence. The entire courtroom leaned forward. The words dropped like thunder. Guilty. Linda's Children burst into tears. Some fell into each other's arms. Others bowed their heads in prayer. Reporters bolted for phones. The judge banged the gavel to quiet the chaos. The man who thought he had escaped time was now facing the rest of his life behind bars. But here's the chilling truth. The verdict didn't erase 35 years of pain. It didn't bring Linda back. It didn't answer every question of what he had done in the shadows for decades. Then the community was left to process. Neighbors who once waved now recoiled. How could a man they trusted be accused of such horror? How had no one seen? It split the town. Some stood in disbelief. Others whispered, "I always felt something was off." Investigators spoke quietly among themselves. The case had broken them open in ways they hadn't expected. 35 years of dust, of dead ends, of faces on missing posters, and then one breakthrough, one DNA match, proved it was never too late. Did this mean other cases could finally be solved? They admitted it. Yes, this case wasn't just about Linda. It was about every cold case file still sitting on shelves, every family still waiting for justice, every victim still unheard. Linda's life, pieced together in fragments, photographs of her smiling, her laughter frozen in home, videos, her children's faces mirroring hers, the life that was stolen, and the future she never lived. Cherry blossoms filled the frame, soft, delicate, falling one by one, each petal a reminder of how fragile life is, each one whispering her name, her. Children standing beneath the blossoms, tears mixed with smiles. Justice had come, late but it had come, and Linda's voice, silenced for 35 years, finally spoke through the verdict. Her story didn't end in darkness, it ended in truth, in accountability, in the promise that no matter how much time passes, some crimes can never truly be buried. The DNA database continues to grow. New matches appear daily. And somewhere, in evidence rooms across the country, boxes wait, cases that seem impossible, families who have given up hope. But Linda's story proves something powerful. Science doesn't forget. Truth doesn't fade. And sometimes, justice arrives exactly when it's needed most. Her name will be remembered, not just as a victim, but as a symbol that even in the coldest cases, even in the longest silences, the truth has a way of breaking through. For Linda Meteer, for her family, and for every case still waiting to be solved. The silence is over. The truth has spoken, and justice, delayed but not denied, has finally come home. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. Stay curious. Stay safe.